You're about to return on the trail to explore World of Warcraft's vast open world in all of its gold, gods, and glory through the eyes of the hiking, traveling, and maybe one day soaring tree hugger. But we seem to have a lot of ground to cover, and you'll need to connect with the land to find out what this beautiful world has in store for travelers such as yourself. Luckily, you have Camixs, a connoisseur of the WoW franchise since 2004, to guide you through the timelines of this game's challenge of beating it while only exploring the terrain. You and I are about to move from south to north of the Eastern Kingdoms. Still, if you are unfamiliar with our travel so far, I encourage you to look at the top right of your screen and get familiar with what we do here at the Exploration Network. Otherwise, let's get into part 2 of this many-part venture. In this episode, we're about to cover 24 zones straight through without stopping, which is 3 more than last time, the finishing point being the crown jewel at the top, Silvermoon City. And if you manage to stick it out until then, you may find a surprise that will make your head scratch and ponder and wonder. Or you may see it right away, as you are a thorough, astute explorer, aren't you? We'll never know until we get into it, so let's begin our venture. When we last left off, we had just finished the untextured lands of Silithus and had hit level 13. Good job for those of you who had guessed that in the previous exploration. I'll give you all a quick breakdown of the notes here. As you can see, the levels really started coming in at the beginning up to level 70, then slowly diminished to every other zone right up to level 13. But like last time, I want you to see if you can garner any more levels in today's run and comment your predictions down below. In any case, after our successful venture, we needed to get to Eastern Kingdoms and take the attack head on for our next continent. And what better way to do so than the boat from Ratchet? Ratchet's boat sails you conveniently to the nestled nook of Booty Bay, as far south of a town as you can go to the Alliance-dominated side of the world. So we strap on our gear, get on our maps, and make our way into the vales of the damp jungle, where we proceed to our first location, the Cape of Stranglethorn. Now, Stranglethorn looks like a jungle, acts like a jungle, and surprise, surprise, welcomes you to the jungle. Welcome to the copyright, we got all your claims. In all seriousness, the Cape isn't too much of a challenge to traverse, primarily because there are no contested battles here, given its neutral state, and most mobs outside of a couple move really slow. On top of that, the only real out-of-the-way spots is to go to the southern half where the blood sails are yo-hoing a scheme, and the island's life that is not for me. As such, while the island gives it an automatic point, I will give it a 4 out of 10 in difficulty, as unless you are traveling this with no mounts and entirely on foot, you won't have a problem running from the mobs. We finish the Cape up in under 13 minutes at the start of this long venture upwards, and meet the border to the northern part of Stranglethorn Vale. Now, Blizzard likes to do everything in twos, and splitting up Stranglethorn probably was a copy of splitting up the Barrens, even though, well, I mean, there's a perfectly good path right here, while the other one jumps you into a ravine. Despite the separate zone structure, Northern Vale is about the same as its Cape counterpart. The only real challenge was swimming to a reef and an island up near the top. Fun fact, the developers love their islands so much that they named 2 of their expansion zones after said islands. But because it's basically the same neutral type zone with a few minor exceptions, I'll give it the same rating for mostly the same reasons. 4 out of 10 difficulty, avoid running into major spots, and you'll be okay. We wrap up Northern STV at around 26 minutes or 13 minutes after the Cape. Funny enough, about the same time too. Now some of the wrinkled brains among you probably think that Duskwood is the next on the list. After all, it's got a cleared shot from the base right to go to the next zone. And while I initially agreed with this assumption, I have a slight dilemma. Duskwood is shaped like a pair of open legs spanning a land terrain. It also has not 1, not 2, but 3 different entrances outside of the zone, not counting the ones we're going in from. But while there's no wrong way to explore, we want to get this challenge done before sundown, so we want to find an efficient way to take care of this dilemma. Now, after some thorough study of the terrain, I think that going to Deadwind's Pass would be the best course of action. We can cross the southern half of Duskwood along the way, get the Hearth to Darkshire, and then clear out Deadwind, Swamp of Sorrows, and Blasted Lands before returning to the Duskwood Inn, moving around the second crest of the map, and then venturing out to Westfall to finish off the lands. So in we go, traveling past the friendly Worgen and undead souls who wish us luck and a safe return as we venture into Deadwind Pass. And what is there really to say about Deadwind? It's another one of those filler spots to stick a raid in with an ominous look to it. But beyond that, its excitement is about as filling as Moonguard. In fact, I'm sure some druids are hiding in the hills waiting for prey to pounce on and drag away into the night. There's no challenges here because, besides going through a gauntlet of ogres, it has 3 neutral standing zones and is a simple up and down motion to boot. As such, I give it a 2 out of 10 rating because while it is small like Noonglade, it actually has mobs in it, so I have to give it points for that at least. We finish Deadwind's Pass at around 34 minutes or 9 minutes after Northern STV and make our way to one of many murky spots in the Swamp of Sorrows. Now, if you've ever wanted to take a vacation spot in some lush forest paradise, Swamp of Sorrows is probably not what you were looking for. This location has several condensed mob spots, including a big chunk of it riddled with an alliance and horde conflicts, war zone between two faction cities. In fact, I'd look at it almost like a jar in layout, except the small bond between the two ends isn't as vast, and instead of a city, you have a temple. That doesn't mean maneuvering what mobs are part of a quest versus what mobs result from going too far to the opposite faction area are entirely transparent. As such, despite some spots being nothing more than empty zones, there is enough here to make it a little bit more tricky to maneuver. So I'll give it a 5 out of 10 in difficulty, and that will go ahead and suffice for this spot. Even still, we finished Swamp of Sorrows at 42 minutes, or roughly 8 minutes after Deadwind's Pass. Blasted Lands is next on the radar. The terrain of an explosion, Blasted Lands is another unique zone that provides two variations to explore, the Cataclysm version and the Warlords of Draenor version. For today's purposes, we're focusing exclusively on the Cata version, with us likely returning for the WAD type when we go to explore Warlords of Draenor. In fact, assume this for all double layouts in the game. We'll be doing Cataclysm version first, followed by the expansion exclusives later on. With that understood, the biggest challenge here is the layout once again, as there isn't one real quick, universal way to explore. However, this is mitigated because I plan on hearthing afterwards when completing the zone, so traversing the Land of Demons isn't too complex when you're not needing to end up at a certain spot. Still, the Dark Portal and Altar of Storms, along with the contested spots between the Alliance and Horde, give this place some difficulty to explore, so 5 out of 10 will suffice simply because where are the islands? We do finish up the Blasted Lands with a time of 53 minutes or 11 minutes after the Swamp of Sorrows, and hearth back into the Kingdom of Stormwind locations, starting with Duskwood. Currently making great time and finishing a lot of the southern half of the Eastern Kingdoms, we find ourselves trekking the western half of Duskwood. Keep in mind, this should be quick because we've covered most of the eastern block when we ran to Jar Jar earlier. As such, I'd have to say once again that the challenge here is the layout of the area. It isn't one closed loop, and if you did choose to go the other ways, you'd have to change your route entirely. Not to mention having to run up the mountainside for Twilight's Grove. Some might think the cemetery was also a challenge, but since it has such an ample space, you only need to graze the outskirts of the marker. As such, since Blizzard didn't put an island here, I'll still give it a 5 out of 10 because of the choices you'll have to make to explore it and where to go next. But beyond that, there's nothing too extreme to note. We finished Duskwood as the final sub 1 hour spot in 58 minutes, or 5 minutes after completing Blasted Lands. Next on our list is the Kingdom's Forgotten Land in Westfall. The classic questing zone for the humans, Westfall is a discolored variant of what Elwyn would likely be under a lack of resources. For our purposes though, the layout is straightforward and is a drawn up C pattern. Now, some of you might be thinking that Mortwake's Tower is the most difficult thing in the spot, but I'm going to go ahead and give that honor to the Defiance entrance because of how much running you have to do indoors to reach it. Still, that part may be more self-inflicted than anything else, so I can honestly say that there isn't much difficulty to this one unless you get an unlucky days. Because of that, and that there is an island here at last, Westfall will get a 3 out of 10 difficulty, as if you're doing this as a Horde member, you may find yourself in some trouble given it's an Alliance exclusive zone. So we wrap up Westfall in 1 hour and 6 minutes or 8 minutes after finishing Duskwood and set our sights on the human starting zone of Elwyn Forest. Now we finally have made it to an easy, relaxed spot to glide through for an Alliance character in that Elwyn Forest poses less than any real danger to the player if this is the case. The only real challenge here is the island. We'll take time to get the flight path, set our Hearthstone, and start working towards Red Ridge while doing light zigzags out the road to get the occasional slightly out of the way spots. Unless you're a Horde player looking to get into Stormwind, this spot is a 2 out of 10 in difficulty due to mobs existing. And that's about it. I will say that it is possible to cheese an entrance into Stormwind if you're the opposite faction, so even doing this zone isn't too complex for the other side. Elwyn is completed at the 1 hour and 18 minute mark, or 12 minutes after Westfall, primarily because of stopping into Stormwind like I mentioned. So now we can finish off the Kingdoms of Stormwind by heading off to the final location in Red Ridge Mountains. Now this is a well done zone by all standards, if you're questing. But if you're exploring, things can get a little tricky. As another Alliance exclusive, Red Ridge on its face may not seem too difficult to the untrained eye. However, you'll quickly realize that while the western half isn't much in the way of complexity, the eastern half is an entirely different ballpark. You see, the zone is built with this idea of having elite combatants to help you fend off challenging encounters, but as we're not questing, we have to go through these zones all by ourselves. That includes places like Stonewatch, Render's Valley, and Altar's Meal, all of which having elite mobs crawling through the space. Although not impossible, I'd imagine we'd have a difficult time here had people not already been questing in said locations. Combine this with a slightly less than ideal layout to navigate, and I'm confident that a 7 out of 10 difficulty in this location wouldn't be too far of a stretch for those trekking this without flying. After completing Red Ridge at 1 hour and 29 minutes or 11 minutes after Elwyn, we'd head up north to the flaming zones of Burning Steppes. The first of the two Blackrock Mountain zones, Burning Steppes, is your seasonal ticket to third-degree burns and smoke fume inhalation. The layout here isn't the greatest to walk efficiently, and there are a couple of tight spots in areas like Blackrock Stronghold, which has constantly spawning and numerous mobs, and the Altar of Storms, which has a group of mobs blocking the way to your objective with no natural way to walk around them. Because of these two spots and the aforementioned layout, some difficulty here is found, so I'll give the neutral spot a 5 out of 10 rating. Although I'd imagine without these chokehold points, we'd probably rate it lower. Despite these spots, however, the Burning Steppe is done in about 1 hour and 38 minutes or 11 minutes after Red Ridge, and so we're going to move on to our second Blackrock zone in Searing Gorge. Considered the less ticket zone of the two, Searing Gorge is more like the secondary burns rather than an incineration of your senses. I suppose the hardest part here is that you could fall into a hole if you're not paying attention, and choosing where to go next in either Lopmadon or Badlands. But outside of these, exploring it isn't much too complex, and it can be done quickly before moving on to the next spot. As a result, I'll give it a 4 out of 10 in difficulty because it isn't a complex layout, but it has a couple of pitfalls that could potentially result in danger. At a quick pace of 7 minutes, or 1 hour and 45 minutes into the recording, we can get out of the frying pan and into the drier climate of the Badlands. Now, I picked this side because Badlands has a way to get to Lopmadan via a northern cavern, so it seems like the sensible progression. For difficulty's sake, however, nothing really stands out here, as most of the spots aren't really packing much in the way of mobs, and areas that are can be avoided by using the outskirts, allowing one to stop being bashed to a pulp. It is about the same difficulty as Searing Gorge, so a 4 out of 10 will suffice here on the way to our next location. At 10 minutes, or around an hour and 55 minutes, we make our leap of faith into a cavern on the way to Lopmadan. Now, we've certainly had our fair share of big lakes in the middle of zones before, but the great thing about this location is that one approach from any direction is usually enough to explore the whole body of water. As such, there isn't much in the way of challenge, especially since it's an Alliance-exclusive zone. Move around the outskirts of the lake, collect all the points as needed, and then wrap around to Thessalamar and the Valley of Kings to complete off your venture here. For this reason, along with its simple layout, I'll give the Loke a 3 out of 10 on difficulty, similar to the other secondary starting zones. Lopmadan is finished off with a time of 2 hours and 3 minutes, or 7 minutes, moving on to Wetlands. Just like Duskwood, Wetlands has a sort of similar situation in which you need to traverse the east and west side before venturing north to move out to another location. It also, it could be drawn as a pair of legs as well, just not nearly as open. The challenge here is finding all the spots that seem a little out of the way for exploration. For instance, this zone has 3 marshes, but if you look at the map, they basically all look the same and are on top of one another in some way or form. As well, places like Angerfang are up in the mountains, kind of like Twilight's Grove. So, since I keep comparing it to Duskwood, I'll give it the same rating as Duskwood, with a 5 out of 10, and call it a fair play. Once getting to the final spot, Wetlands is completed at 2 hours and 58 minutes before crossing the Thandal Span and moving on to the Arathi Highlands. Now, some of you might have just noticed something is a little bit off, and if you did, then shh. Let's see if the others figure it out. If you haven't yet, then don't worry. Most of what I'm talking about here will make sense closer to the end of the video. Arathi is yet another one of these lands that has 2 exploration types in it, but once again for today we'll be looking at the Cataclysm version for expansion purposes. Now the most complicated part of Arathi is Faldir's Cove, which I immediately go for by jumping off the side of Thandal Span and swimming with my aquatic form. This spot has never been an easy reach for any players, so I figured taking a dive bomb was the best approach. Also, Galen's Fall as an Alliance player can be solved by taking a line of sight from the guards with a wall stationed on the outskirts. Once you get past these zones, the layout itself isn't that bad despite its contested nature, so its 5 out of 10 difficulty will suffice for this zone's minor challenges. We wrap up the Highlands in 3 hours and 9 minutes, or roughly 11 minutes after Wetlands. Hinterlands is known for this long, winding altar to get to the top of a troll settlement, as well as having a ravine where the Horde have settled themselves near the shoreline, while the Alliance are nestled into hills. Notably though, none of these are much of an issue to venture. For the altar, merely walk up to the front of the steps and explore the whole village. I guess in some instances, your character can look up, mark on the map, and then move on to Mal. Same with the cliffside. Merely run to the edge of it, and Revantusk, as well as all of its contents, can be explored just by standing over top. Initially thinking this was going to be one of the more tough zones, we instead are left without much of a way of challenge, and give it a 4 out of 10 for middling difficulty. After arriving at Airy Peak to finish off Hinterlands, we now have a time of 3 hours and 20 minutes, or 12 minutes after Arathi Highlands, and with Hillsbrad on the horizon, we're now starting to reach Horde territories. That was a lot of H's, and I don't know what to do about that. Now, while most zones have featured some difficulties, Hillsbrad surprisingly had more than I was expecting to see. For one, the amount of areas to explore was vastly more than any other zones, as it seems 2 things occurred here. One, most hidden zones, as I've discussed previously, are pretty much explicit here. And for 2, Ultrak and Hillsbrad are treated as the same territory. This means I must take on both ends of the map to cover this vast expanse. There are 4 Horde exclusive locations on this map, 2 of which aren't cakewalks to explore. On top of this, you have to explore even the smallest of spaces to complete the zone, as missing something may not be immediately noticed on first glance. For instance, I actually missed a hill on my route to leave and had to backtrack to get it, only to get flanked by Terran Mill guards and almost die. And to top it all off, there's an island on a sizable water mass next to our location. So chances are, if you're an Alliance player, this will likely be a 7 out of 10 zone to take care of with the layout, locations of enemy cities, and the swim. If you're a Horde, it'll likely probably be much lower. Still, after 3 hours and 43 minutes, or 23 minutes after Hinterlands, we wrap up the island and head over to a point of debate. So, some people might be asking, does the Ruins of Gilneas count? After all, merely stepping foot on the zone gives you a full extent of where it is, and it's also not marked on the achievements. But I'm going to go ahead and say yes, it technically counts for this reason: the Undead questline. So if you've ever done the Silver Pine Forest questline, you'll know that the Undead actually use extensive parts of Gilneas to tell the story of its northern zone. In that regard, I'll look at Gilneas not as its own separate state, but as an extension of Silverpine. Some may disagree with this reasoning, but as far as I know, the other spots I'm intentionally holding off for don't have this problem, so I'll be taking this into account. Besides, Gilneas isn't difficult to explore anyway, as there isn't any mobs here unless you're actually doing the questline, so no harm in milking around. Silverpine, however, is a different story. The land is sort of like Hillsbrad in terms of its maneuverability. While I'd argue some parts may be more difficult, like getting to the Sepulchre, the difficulty is offset by the amount of friendly mobs despite it being a Horde exclusive zone. Most places can be explored because of NPCs fighting long enough for you to sneak by. Still though, this land shouldn't be undermined for its challenge as an Alliance player waltzing through. Combine this with the fact that there is an island, of course, and we've got a difficulty rating of 6 out of 10 to round this little adventure of the Silverpine's Gilneas location. As expected, combining these 2 zones was going to give it a little bit more of a time frame, so after 4 hours and 6 minutes, or roughly 23 minutes after Hillsbrad, we move on to the top 5 zones left to explore. But it's sure to be the roughest and toughest of them all. After all, Tears Fall is next, home of the undead and their most cunning plague abilities, and surely all of the Undercity are hungry for Teldrasilian blood. This invasion into the Undercity will be the most complex for the tree huggers such as... And if you just run through this tunnel right here, you can make it all the way down, just enough to get credit for the Undercity. Hurrah! Is this joke getting old enough yet? Yes, once again, we've got another situation where the starter zones aren't nearly as complicated as they probably should be for an opposite faction player. Most zones are able to be patrolled on the outskirts and explored afterwards. Even Death Neo, which I thought was going to be a genuine problem because of its wall, only requires you to approach it from an angle to get the credit. So the hardest part actually ends up at the Bulwark, as it is strictly a Horde zone, and therefore the camp is primarily a Horde landmine for anybody trying to walk into Western Plaguelands. But if that's the only real worry, then be rest assured that 5 out of 10 difficulty is the highest rating that this zone's going to get from us. We finished Tears Fall at 4 hours and 17 minutes, or 11 minutes after Silverpine Forest. Now, Western Plaguelands might have some of you thinking that the ability to just scoot by Anderhall is near impossible. After all, it is a triple conflict zone with no real sense of safety, right? Well, contrary to your belief, all you gotta do is stay at the Alliance end of Anderhall and you'll be alright, because so long as you haven't done any part of the questline, there is a safe haven for both factions. In fact, once you do this, the hardest part of the layout of the zone is that you have to intentionally go north and south in long directions along with the standard west patterns. Now, I would give this one a 4 out of 10, but this location also has a freaking island that's really out of the way and inconvenient to get to. So instead, I'll give it a reluctant 5 out of 10, as contested or not, it's pretty easy to maneuver. Western Plaguelands is finished in 4 hours and 33 minutes, or roughly 16 minutes after Tears Fall Blades. Let's move on to the not-so-restored Eastern Plaguelands. Now, the Eastern Pattern part has quite a few difficulties, starting with the neutral marker of Plaguewood. This part of the map encompasses things such as Plaguewood Tower, a town, an entrance to Stratholme, and a few other surprises. And it's not easy to maneuver, as Scourge run rampant through the area, covering most of the ways that you try to get through here. But even getting past that mess, there's still a few chokehold points that you need to get to in order to succeed in finishing off this map. There's instances like pushing through the Gauntlet of Tyr to get to the ruins of the Scarlet Enclave, and then pushing through the Scourge encampment so you can go out to Death's Breach, which is also discoverable on this map. Top it all off with being unable to explore Arcturus, and even though that isn't part of the required map, it still makes me a little sad to see it covered in Fog of War. So for this reason, I have to give this one a 7 out of 10. I almost gave it an 8 out of 10 because Arcturus is impossible to do without being a Death Knight or flying, but to be honest, it's not required, as I'd be giving it artificial points. We wrap up the Eastern Plaguelands, and at a time of 4 hours and 52 seconds, or 19 minutes after Western Plaguelands, we move on to the second to last zone in Ghostlands. One of the last Horde exclusives on the landmass with spooky scary skeletons running down the dead spire, Ghostlands is mildly annoying to wander. Now, it could just be because I'm not a fan of Burning Crusade maps and layouts, we'll get to that later, but this zone has quite a few twists and turns to make it not a simple task to guide through. For one, you have Zol-Amah, which is a major part of the southeast, you have the Enclave to the northeast, you have Deathholm to the southwest, and you've got Tranquillance sitting in the direct middle. Unless you're doing zigzags in every which direction, this layout seems widely sparse with minimal forgiveness. But the hardest part has to be Tranquillance because its route to explore it is just so tiny. I practically had to be in the city to explore it and almost pulled aggro from guards before I got the official credit. And I'll say it, Ghostlands gets credit for being decently difficult solely on these two merits alone. I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 as an Alliance player. Still though, we do manage to finish it at 5 hours and 12 minutes, or roughly 20 minutes after Eastern Plaguelands, and move on to the ultimate spot in Eversong Woods. Now, you were probably expecting me to ramble on and on about how the Blood Elves would probably be one of the greatest challenges in the world, and then show you some stupid gimmicks and how I got around it. But no, this zone is actually what I expected most of the other Horde zones to be. Now, I could go on about certain things, for instance, the wonky style of exploring, as well as the Horde exclusive spots, which there are 5 of, but there are 2 particular things I'd like to point out. First off, to get to Sunstrider Isles, you have to go through Falcon Wing Square. There's no way about this. You need to use the archway into the small town and roam around. So that seems almost like inevitable, right? Well, not exactly. If you know anything about AI, then you know that the Flight Masters don't automatically attack unless you attack them first. So you need to hug the wall as best you can to the left, push around the side as soon as possible, and then run out to where you can get to the Isles. Now, the Isles themselves are a simple swim around the bridge to explore. But once that's done, if you haven't explored everything, then you need to do the same thing for Falcon Wing, but backwards. So in other words, this is dangerous and could take some time. But the second part is, you've guessed it, Silvermoon itself. Now, while I have been able to cheese 3 out of the 4 of the major cities, Blizzard ensured that if you want this one on your map as an Alliance player, you have to get inside. I checked the walls, the entry gate next to the entrance, I tried exploiting it, and there is no way around it. The only way in is through that gateway. So I tried to see if there was a way to do this in the least painful capacity, and I figured it out. We're going to die at least once, that much is a given, but whether or not we die again is dependent on how far in we have to go. And as it turns out, as long as you enter into the halfway corridor before you completely get into the city, you'll get credit. So as best as I could, I ran into the guards, allowed myself to die, and then using the ghost function, I went to said halfway point, safe via line of sight, and healed up before ultimately using my Hearthstone, as Silvermoon was my last place needed to venture. So because of a spot with death being impossible to avoid, along with layouts making things outright complicated, it really stood out to me as one of the most difficult situations to have to occur. Most other zones are pretty much avoidable in this regard, but this one stood alone as a slam dunk to my adventures, so I'll be giving it an 8 out of 10 in difficulty as an Alliance player. What's funny is, if you're Horde, you'd probably only give it a 2 out of 3. Most of our problems stemmed from our faction more than anything else. So we wrapped up Eversong Woods with a time of 5 hours and 33 minutes, or 21 minutes after Ghostlands. And that would be the end of the story, but I think there's one thing that some of you have figured out which I haven't discussed yet. And if you haven't figured it out, I hope you haven't clicked away, because I've got a little bonus for you. Let's rewind a bit just before I was about to leave Moat-Madon and look at the time frames between this spot and Wetlands conclusion. Now, I'm not going to claim to be an entire expert of this field of exploration, but I, as I'm sure you, doubt we spent almost an hour between these two zones. That means one of 2 things. Either I spent a really long time talking to NPCs, or maybe, just maybe, there's something else I missed that you caught on earlier. That's right. For our little bonus, we're heading to Dunmoreau. Now you might be thinking to yourselves, the Dwarven Starting Zone, why are you doing this? What's so difficult about a random snowy mountain, especially for the correct faction? Well, my friends, I'm about to break it down for you, but first, if you like what you've seen so far, leave a like and join the community. I'd love to interact with each of you in the future videos. Thank you. Now then, Dunmoreau is an interesting specimen for a couple of reasons. For one, its layout is something to behold, as its locations are all over the place, making it somewhat disjointed and unable to be easily explored. While coming from Moat-Madon would make it a general principle to go from east to west, there's also a major city to the north, and the starting zone of the dwarves to the south. Not to mention Cold Ridge has a tunnel you must pass through to get to the other side, which requires an on-foot section. Furthermore, New Tinkertown is one of those train spots where there's a couple of elite mobs that can be found while covering ground here, and the entrance to Gnomeregan is here, giving us yet another reason to have to go into the Gnomish starting zone versus the Troll Isles, where all we had to do was swim up to it. But the crown and jewel and why this is the bonus is one spot on a map that is ordinarily impossible to get to without certain requirements, and that is the Ironforge airstrip sitting in the northern eastern part of the map. Now normally to get here you have 2 options. The first is to fly. Obviously, if you're level 30, then this place is a cakewalk. Then again, all places are a cakewalk if you can just fly them. However, that option is unavailable to us due to our level, so the second option is to complete the quest line that leads up to traveling to the airstrip. As we've established, however, that isn't an option either because quest lines are off limits per our desire to only gain experience while exploring. So, what do? If we can't fly, and we can't quest, then we need to find an unintended way to travel up this part. And this is where I actually spent most of my time in Dunmerog, looking for solutions via research on Wowhead and YouTube. And after a short amount of time, I found two methods that worked. First was what I'll coin the Skyrim horse method, as it requires essentially moving up a mountainside and making specific jumps to get to the airstrip's lower terrain. A YouTuber named Grayscribe Productions posted this back nearly 12 years ago showing off the method. And while it is in theory possible, and I thank the YouTuber for giving us insight on this spot, WoW horses don't work like Skyrim runs. So unless you are absolutely high tier and finding specific pickles to jump, this one may take many attempts. So let's try something else. There's a more modern video, likely set in the Cataclysm era or later, that showed off another method that had much longer travel time, but would be easier to pull off. A YouTuber by the name of Vigigan, by the way, apologize if I said that wrong, shows out that if you head back to North Tinkertown and then tread around the mountainside to make one easy jump, you can essentially ride the mountains up and then back down to Ironforge. I figured why not give it a shot, and it worked surprisingly well, so I rode the mountain upwards. You do have to be careful, as if you fall off the wrong time, you might overshoot towards the wetlands from the mountainside, but essentially you'll climb over Ironforge and then move down the side to eventually get to the airstrip and gain your achievement. What's more, you can use the chopper to return to the quarry if you desire. So there it is, Dunmerog. Because of this little puzzle, along with the layout, I'll be giving it an 8 out of 10, as there is no other zone like this in the Eastern Kingdoms. Save for Arteris, of course, but as I mentioned, Arteris doesn't require you to have it done in order to get the achievement, while the airstrip does. We wrap up Dunmerog and head back to Lomadan to finish the run at 2 hours and 36 minutes, or roughly 33 minutes after finishing Lomadan. Now again, you're probably looking and going, there's 3 more spots on the map here, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now that each of these are specific expansion zones, and plus Squel de Nas has a level lock in it, so even if I wanted to, I can't make my way up there, at least not yet. So the total time took 5 hours and 33 minutes, with Dunmerog taking the spot as the most exciting zone. Though Silver Moon was a close second, I'll give Silver Moon the most difficult for this reason. Least interesting has to go to Deadwind. 3 zones with nothing, it's just unappealing. But I'm sure you like seeing challenges if you've gotten this far, and after leaving your level prediction down below, check out this playthrough I did as a marksmanship goblin with essentially no ranged weapons for a majority of the playthrough right here.